and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our virtual art history lecture with Felicia Zavarella-Stadelman. On behalf of the Hudson Library and Historical Society, I would like to thank you all so much for your continued support of our programming. I know programming is an important part of our library, and although we can't be together in person at the library, we're so happy that we can continue to bring you the very best in programming through our virtual programming series. We have a lot of exciting programming coming up in the next couple months. You can get all of that information from our website, hudsonlibrary.org, and all of our virtual programs you can register online. So we hope that you continue to join us for our virtual programming series. I'd like to welcome back our speaker tonight. Felicia Zavarella-Stadelman is our local art historian. Whether you're new to her lectures or have been to many, I just want to share a little bit about her. She has been a longtime speaker at the library. Felicia began her lecture series on artist biographical sketches in 2013. If you can believe it, she's been doing her lectures for 8 years at the library. She's been one of our most popular speakers and always a pleasure to have her back. We are excited because she's done her series of Through the Eyes of the Artist. She's done for quite a while now, and she's been working on some new lectures, including tonight's lecture. Felicia, are we a debut? Is this a debut for you?
You're my first audience, yes.
Well, we are very excited to have you with us today, and we're excited to hear your new lecture. I just want to mention that tonight's program is being recorded, so if you missed the program or want to share it with others, all of our past programming can be viewed from the library's YouTube channel. You can access that from hudsonlibrary.org, and at the bottom of our homepage, we do have a link to our YouTube channel where you can access all of Felicia's past programs, because I know all of them were recorded. I'm pretty sure all of them, or close to all of them, were if you've missed any of her past lectures. So thank you, Felicia, for joining us, and thank you for your willingness to take your lecture series on the virtual side here with us. It's always a pleasure to have you.
It was a learning experience, but I'm loving it. But I miss everyone. I'm anxious to see everyone's faces. So should I go ahead and get started?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, I'm going to share my screen. Well, thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. It's a beautiful night out, and I do appreciate you being here. So let's talk about Expressionism. In realist art circles, objectivity is the name of the game. For example, let's say that an artist's subject is a bowl of fruit. Some would want the painter to depict the fruit in the most accurate way possible, with every blemish and every curve rendered. But what about the artists who don't wish to objectively remove their emotions from their work? Does subjectivity disqualify an artwork from galleries and museums? I'm going to let Edvard Munch's The Scream, pioneering work of Expressionism in the Expressionism movement, answer that question for you. So what do we mean when we say Expressionism? Impressionism and the works of the Impressionist artists like Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir sought to depict light, motion, and color as accurately as they could in a two-dimensional medium. Expressionism is a lot less concerned about reality. That's basically the difference. Instead, Expressionism puts the personal and emotional at the forefront of art, with the subject matter and accuracy the last of its worries. Expressionism is a period in which new and influential explorations of psychology and human behavior were all taking place, and artists started to look at the world more subjectively, often distorting its depictions to achieve a more emotional effect. So for these creators, personal experiences and feelings became more important than physical reality, and the art inspired by the Expressionism movement still holds power to move and challenge the viewers. Expressionism first emerged simultaneously in various cities across Germany as a response to the widespread anxiety about humanity's increasingly conflicting relationship with the world and the accompanying loss of feelings and authenticity and spirituality. So in part of a reaction against Impressionism and academic art, Expressionism was inspired more heavily by the symbolist currents in the late 19th century. In fact, the term Expressionism was coined by a Czech historian, Antonín Majecek, in 1910 to specifically mean the opposite of Impressionism. Art was now meant to come from within the artist rather than a depiction of an external visual world. So the standards for assessing the quality of a work of art then became the character of the artist's feelings rather than an analysis of the composition. This is a quote from Edvard Munch. "No longer shall I paint interiors with men reading and women knitting. I will paint the living people who breathe and feel and suffer and love." Franz Mark, a very famous expressionist, said, "Art is nothing but the expression of our dreams. The more we surrender to it, the closer we get to the inner truth of things, of our dream life, the true life that scorns questions and does not see them." So by pushing back at centuries of artistic tradition, Expressionism changed the entire landscape of modern art and inspired numerous 21st century artists to let their emotions take the reins. So how did this movement begin in the first place? Let's talk about the bridge over Impressionist waters, or the origins of Expressionism. At the turn of the century in Western Europe, society was evolving at a rapid pace. Intense industrialization had taken the continent by storm, and with innovations in manufacturing and communication, worlds started creating this sense of unease for the general public. And the breakneck growth of technology and urbanization in these large cities also brought with it feelings of isolation and disconnect with the natural world. So understandably, these emotions and anxieties started bleeding into the art of the era. Now, the two art groups that created Expressionism as we know today are Die Brücke, or the bridge, and Der Blaue Reiter, or the Blue Rider, formed in Germany in the early 20th century. And this started in Dresden. There were 4 architectural students who created a communal art group called Die Brücke, or the bridge. And they wanted to serve as a bridge to the future by evoking intense emotional responses using unnatural forms, colors, and compositions, all inspired by the modern world, but interpreted a little different way in our minds. And their work shared similarities with another movement that was happening in France called Fauvism, led by Henri Matisse. And his use of bright colors and atypical shapes to convey an emotion inspired this group of architects who wanted to create this bridge from reality into the subconscious. So Die Brücke was meant to be this youthful response to centuries of realism in art. Now, in 1906, there was a manifesto that was made on a woodcut print by Die Brücke, and it was kind of their call to arms. With a belief in continuing evolution, it said, in a new generation of creators, as well as appreciators, we call together all youth. And as youth carrying the future, we intend to obtain freedom of movement and of life for ourselves in opposition to older, well-established powers. So this was a real departure. This continues to say, whoever renders directly and authentically that which impels him to create is one of us. So through this call to action, the young artists of Western Europe were tasked to create this new art movement called Expressionism. They pushed boundaries like the Fauvists did, but Die Bruck brought the underground German culture of the nightclubs, the lower class decadence into their art while still conveying their own personal sense of emotion and unrest. Now, the second group, called Der Blaue Reiter, named after Vasily Kandinsky's painting The Blue Rider, was formed in Munich in 1911. And this art collective was made of Russian immigrants like Kandinsky. This Kandinsky painting was chosen as the group's namesake because of its depiction of this figure on horseback riding from reality into a spiritual and emotional realm. Der Blaue Reiter artists were fascinated with the rendering of the spiritual as opposed to the physical. And their styles varied. They had interests in primitivism, and the emotional landscape dominated their work, but was interpreted in a less realistic way. Now, as opposed to Die Bruck, or the Bridge, the Blue Rider group was a very large force in the development of abstract expressionism, which was the next movement in art after expressionism. It was abstract expressionism. Expressionism rejects realism and only conveys emotions. Expressionism still retains the sense of form and symbolism, but does it on a higher level. So the Blue Rider merges these ideas, creating a completely new branch of expressionism that influenced modern art to this day. Now, at the outbreak of the First World War, Die Bruck and Der Blue Rider disbanded, but their legacy lived on. And Expressionism continued to grow in popularity, and it's still practiced in the 21st century. From the genesis of Expressionism to today, artists have embraced the movement's focus on capturing emotions through evocative imagery. Now, here are the artists that brought their own unique expressionist energy to the different moments over the past 100 years. And the most influential person of this group was Vincent Van Gogh. He was one of the most notable modern artists of Expressionism. Now, originally, the Impressionists ridiculed him by calling him an expressionist. It wasn't meant to be a compliment. It was meant to be an insult. And he's the Dutch painter who lived from 1853 to 1890. And he is believed to have started the expression of emotion and symbolism in his work in a style that became known to symbolize expressionism. Now, during his lifetime, his colors were described as loud and harsh and a pain to the eyes by artists like Monet. And Vincent Van Gogh was labeled also by art critics as an expressionist. The fact that you could see emotion in his paintings was perceived as a negative attribute. Now, the Impressionist painters back in Paris viewed his work as wild emotion. And beyond that, the symbolism that he infused into his work separated him dramatically from the Impressionists. This is one of the works that utilizes the most symbolism in his work. It's painted from memory because he wasn't allowed to leave his room. We know a lot about how he felt about this painting and the work that he did at this point because He kept letters and wrote about every one of the pieces of work. He said it's a night-filled sky with swirling objects, which are the stars. He said the yellow represents my passion, hot and ablaze, caught in the swirl of my confusion. This is when he was put in an institution against his will. Excuse me. Below the rolling hills of the horizon lies a poetic town, and the peaceful steeple gives me a sense of security, he writes, while the massive dark structure is developing this sense of isolation and impending doom. Although he didn't start painting until the final 10 days of his life, the final 10 years of his life, he failed to sell many paintings, only sold one piece of work during his lifetime. And his paintings and drawings are now some of the world's best known works of modern expressionist art. In 1990, Sunflowers sold for $58 million, while in 1998, his Portrait of the Artist Without a Beard sold for $71.5 million. As a result, he's now viewed as one of the greatest modern expressionist artists. And his style of painting, the vivid colors slapped on a canvas with a broad brushstroke of thick paint, was genuinely revolutionary and inspired generations of 20th century painters. In particular, was this highly animated style of gestural painting, which began with this tradition of the idea of Expressionism, a dramatic move away from the Impressionists. And he writes, "It is only now what I've learned in Paris, it's leaving me, and I'm returning to the ideas that I had in the country before I knew the Impressionists. I should not be surprised if the Impressionists soon find fault with my way of working, for it's been fertilized by my own ideas rather than theirs. Because instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily in order to express my emotions more forcibly." And he starts executing one painting after another in this new, powerful language. He said, "I'm actually getting an eye for this kind of emotional painting." He paints one of the most symbolic expressionist pictures called Cafe Terrace at Night, where he uses this starry background. The bright yellow draws attention to the cafe. The yellow becomes his symbol of love and acceptance, which is contradictory to what was happening in this cafe at the time. When he would enter the cafe, people would shun him and laugh at him and write about him in the newspapers about what an unusual fellow he was. But he creates this sense of balance between the dark city and this bright yellow entrance, this symbol of power and love. And more importantly than anything up to this point, he's now completely identifying with his paintings, and he becomes immersed in the symbolism that he incorporates into them. Symbolism is now infused in his work. For example, in this one, the single white flower, which is different from the rest, is him. The blue flowers are the Impressionists. He felt that he was similar, but yet different. He also created some of his most remarkable masterpieces as a reflection of his life and his emotions that are entangled in the feelings that he had of self-worth and hopelessness. And this image conveys that so specifically and directly. He keeps the eyes moving around this painting while all these other factors take force. His artwork was once described as that of a wild beast, and yet his technique is now described as a world-renowned art critic said, an impassioned brushstroke in symbolic and intense color with surface tension in the movement and vibration of form and line. His fusion of form and content is powerful, dramatic, lyrically rhythmic, imaginative, and emotional, for the artist was completely absorbed in the comprehension of the spiritual essence of man and nature. He was one of the modern era's most gifted and emotionally misunderstood artists. Although he was grossly underappreciated in his lifetime, he was a genius. He was impulsive and spontaneous, and he embodied many of the ideals of the post-Impressionist movement, which became known as the Expressionist movement. The portrait of Dr. Gachet sold for $82.5 million. And in this, he strives to elicit a complex mixture of emotion with the viewer rather than portraying the naturalistic depiction of the sitter. He created these painterly rhythms and swirling forms within an arrangement in order to convey elements of strength and intelligence and melancholy. And he would write about each one of his paintings, so we know that this is what he intended, for example, in particular to this painting. Such an intimate and personalized interpretation, he epitomized the rejection of the Impressionist optical observation in favor of an emotionally laden representation that appealed to the viewer's heart rather than to their minds. And his influence on the outcome of art is amazing. Using his example, it became a manner that many other notable artists followed, like Henri Matisse. His initial reaction to Vincent Van Gogh's paintings was horror. He said, "I was absolutely shocked and felt as though the earth was given way beneath my feet." But Matisse claimed, "Van Gogh was my inspiration. Through his paintings, he explained color theory to me." To Matisse, the style of Van Gogh was the road worth following, and he painted these light-filled landscapes with bold, bright colors in a very provocative way. He always referred to Van Gogh as his master. Paul Cezanne was a French artist and post-impressionist painter whose works are also thought to be the transition from the 19th century conception of the artistic endeavor to this completely new world of art in the 20th century. And he claims that Vincent van Gogh was an inspiration to him. These two radically different worlds, the one that ends with the Impressionist movement and starts with the Expressionist one, made a completely significant shift in art history and overall among the artistic and other spheres that were developing based on emotion at this time. The Impressionist movement was originated in France in the 19th century and was a way to couple the specific realities of the time. And the Impressionists tried to capture the impression of the momentary effect of a scene, the impression of the light on a scene. The Impressionists actually tried to create the feeling of movement by using those long brush strokes, the loose brush strokes, the sketchy lines in order to create a feeling of or an impression of an attitude. The Impressionists were trying to combine emotions with reality, however, but the Expressionists were trying to heighten emotions through art and eliminate reality. This was done in order to create an emotional effect. Impressionists were portraying subjective reality rather than realism. Expressionists painted this style to incorporate fantasy and aggression in their subject matter in order to show extremes of emotion. And these two completely different worlds that did not share the same interpretation finally come to meet in the same place where Paul Cezanne is concerned, when he comes forward with his art. He was one of those artists where his artwork was considered to be a mix of the two worlds, Impressionism and Expressionism, and contains characteristics defined in both worlds. His works are identified as the most dominant influence in the abstraction of modern art. His artworks were also captured often with these repetitive brushstrokes, highly characterized, clearly recognizable images, and yet still somewhat abstract. The Impressionists were using long brushstrokes to create an impression, but Cezanne, like Van Gogh, was using small brushstrokes that build up a form into this complex field. Cezanne is considered to be the man that formed the bridge between the late 19th century Impressionism and this new different line of artistic inquiry, which eventually became known as modern abstract art and moved towards Cubism. Now, both Matisse and Picasso are said to have remarked that Cezanne is the father to us all. Expressionism was a modernist art movement that sought to depict emotional states beyond visible reality, immersing to the complete self within this painting process. And the artists distanced themselves from painting the natural world in flux like the Impressionists did, where it was perceived as being pretty kind of an innocuous decoration for your home and fireside that gave you an impression of simplicity and mood. Instead, the Expressionists privileged the internal emotional landscape of an individual. Using that vivid color, brutally reduced forms, and strange angles, the artists created a distorted, exaggerated material world representative of our psyche. Expressionism developed in the early 1900s until the 1930s, and it was considered to be brash and ugly, and it aesthetically permeated the work of many of the revolutionary artists. Bringing these crude forms and clashing colors firmly grounded the Expressionist movement into the 20th century. So screaming and writhing and floating and warping, which were many key Expressionist details in work, were states of extreme emotion that are creating this creating this change in objective reality. And these images fought with the relationship of the dominant artistic representation, which included realism and naturalism. And as a result of their intense, provocative display, the images created kind of simultaneously, along with Cubism and Surrealism and Dadaism, the Expressionists conjured up images of this collective anxiety felt by those alienated by city life, giving kind of a face to the dehumanizing effects of industrialization and the absence of authenticity and spirituality. So that was the transition into the modern that caused so much anxiety in society that was now represented in canvas. Edvard Munch, who was very much influenced by Van Gogh and wrote a lot in his journals about being influenced by Van Gogh, provoked particularly influential paintings that encouraged expressionists in this distortion of form and the deployment of strong colors to convey anxieties and yearnings. The late 19th century Norwegian post-impressionist painter Edvard Munch emerged as an important source of inspiration for the expressionists. It's like he laid the groundwork for them. His vibrant and emotionally charged works opened up new possibilities for introspective expression. In particular, his frenzied canvases expressed the anxiety of the individual within in this newly modernized European society, and the scream demonstrated the conflict, he writes, between spirituality and modernity as the central theme for his work. Here in his most famous painting, he said, "I depict the battle between the individual and society." And the setting of the scream was suggested to the artist while he was walking along a bridge in Oslo. He said, "The sky turned red as blood, and I stopped and I leaned against the fence and I was shivering with fear. He said, "I heard the enormous, infinite scream of nature." So this painting evoked in Munch the jolting emotion of the encounter and exhibits a general anxiety towards the tangible world. The representation of his emotional response to the scene would form the basis of the Expressionists' artistic interpretation. And the theme of this idea of individual alienation, as represented in this image, would persist throughout the 20th century, captivating Expressionist artists as the central feature of modern art and then eventually of life. So throughout his artistic career, he focused on scenes of death and agony, anxiety in these distorted and emotionally charged portraits, all themes and styles that would eventually be adopted by the Expressionists. The classic phase of the Expressionist movement lasted from around 1905 until about 1920 and spread initially throughout Europe. The arrival of Expressionism announced this new standard in the creation and the judgment now of art. The art was meant to come from within the artist, rather than from a depiction of the external visual world. A standard for assessing the quality of work now became the character of the artist's feelings, rather than the analysis of the composition in terms of accuracy and light and etc. So Expressionist artists are often employing these swirling, swaying exaggerations executed with bold brushstrokes in the depiction of their subjects. And these techniques were meant to convey this very difficult and charged emotional state of the artist, reacting to the anxieties of the modern world. And through their confrontation with the urban world of the 20th century, Expressionist artists developed a powerful mode of social criticism in their figural renderings in these bold colors. Their representations of the modern city included depictions of alienated individuals, a psychological byproduct of what was considered to be recent urbanization that was changing the world as we knew it. And they very often depicted prostitutes who were used to comment on capitalism's role and the emotional distancing of individuals within cities. New technologies and massive urbanization efforts altered the individual's worldview, and the artists reflected the psychological impact of these developments by moving away from realistic representation of what they saw towards this emotional and psychological rendering of how the world was going to now affect them. Now, the roots of Expressionism can be traced to other post-Impressionist artists like Gustav Klimt in Vienna during the time of the Vienna Succession. The members of the growing upper middle class were now becoming politically and socially strong, and they wanted their voices to be heard in this new democratic society. Ambiguity and the fears and doubts of this new class were the fuel for new artistic and social movements. And it was the time of Sigmund Freud. He changed the entire view of people's emotional lives with his theories of psychology. Now emotion was freely expressed, splashed on a canvas with color and a force in the style that was called Expressionism. It was a period of conflicting needs and desires and symbols. And Gustav Klimt's life spanned this fascinating and dramatic period. His art reflects its unrest, the shift from the security of the 19th century into the anxiety of the 20th century. Vienna was his home. It was one of the most brilliant and culturally active cities of the era. It was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, home to Sigmund Freud, Gustav Mahler, and other creative luminaries. And it was in Vienna where new concepts in art and music and literature and philosophy were all forging ahead. And embodying the spirit of that era was the work of Gustav Klimt, with his graceful arabesques, their hint of Byzantine mystery, his allegorical symbolism, all charged with conflicting meaning, his unsettling landscapes, the beautiful women. Love, incidentally, was the first painting where he used the technique of shadowy background figures that were foretelling the future. For example, he writes, unbeknownst to the couple embracing in the foreground, the shadows in the background hold the faces of evil, old age, and death, even the transient faces of youth, and they transport the unknowing couple into the silent conspiracy of life and its sometimes painful path, he writes. Now, because his paintings were so evocative, his paintings drew charges of obscenity, which he often faced and was very often arrested for. However, he was not intimidated by the intense opposition of his work. His work was constantly criticized for being too sensual. His symbolism seemed too deviant. He was referred to as l'enfant terrible. However, he wasn't insulted or intimidated by this. Instead, he presented this painting in response, and he called it To My Critics. The painting only increased the general criticism against him, and it shows this smiling, beautiful woman projecting her bottom at the viewer, an obvious response to all of those who attacked this work as pornography and perverted excess in the paintings that he created during this time. So he calls it To My Critics for obvious reasons. The new expressive society found their voice in education and culture, but mostly in art. And they wanted to divorce themselves from the traditional forms of art, from the romantic neoclassical movement, into that, which eventually moved to the historical depiction of realistic events. This new expressionist movement appears on the scene, and the work was concerned with emotion, the depiction of anguish and confusion and mood and sensation. And his work was celebrated. He even became women's favorite portraitist because of the open sensuality of his work. And it clashed with the hypocritical Victorian repression that was represented during this time against women. So under the appearance of respectability, he cleverly painted what interested him most. And he said that was women's maddening eroticism. What's most fascinating is that he painted the women nude before covering them up with clothes. His art was becoming more and more distinctive and more evocative. He honed this decorative Byzantine mosaic-like pattern into a masterful art form, combining gold and brilliant color, tendrils of fluid forms, carefully designed repetition to create great works of art that are all symbolic as well as ambiguous. Turn of the century society was obsessed with the aesthetic as well as the erotic. And it was a time of happiness and abandon. And it was also a time of dazzling intellectualism. Gustav Klimt's art spoke to the deep psychological truth of his time, and he was violently criticized for that. His subtly erotic work was frequently displayed behind a screen so as not to corrupt the sensibilities of women or the young. His work reflected the contradiction of the time, and he combined a deliciously sensuous mixture of opposites: ecstasy and terror, life and death, austerity and pleasure. His lavish mode of rendering these subjects with a bright palette, elaborately patterned surfaces, and elongated bodies was a step towards these exotic colors, the gestural brushstroke, the jagged forms that later Expressionists eventually adopted from his art. The Expressionists sought to depict a world as it felt rather than how it looked. And by doing so, it reinvigorated art with authenticity and expressive force. The Expressionists rejected the dominant style of conventional art and the subject matter of the visual culture of the 20th century, and instead they looked into boldly colorful, introspective paintings of the post-impressionists who eventually explored the darker side of life and artistic imagination in their work. So in their quest for authenticity, Expressionists also looked for inspiration beyond European art and culture into native folk tradition and tribal art. So reflecting a common attitude of the time, the Expressionists' work was perceived as primitive, unevolved, and therefore closer to the origins of humanity. They borrowed stylistically from what they saw, including geometric ornamentation, decorative patterning, and flattened planes. And this is some of the work that evoked those feelings. Now, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec took this idea to a whole new level. He was a French painter, printmaker, draftsman, caricaturist, illustrator, whose immersion in this colorful and theatrical life of Paris in the late 19th century allowed him to produce a collection of enticing, elegant, and provocative images of the modern, sometimes decadent affairs of the times. And he excelled at depicting people in their environment with color and movement and the gaudy nightlife present with the glamour stripped away. He was a master at painting crowd scenes where the figures were all highly individualized. At the time these paintings were done, the individual figures in his larger paintings could be identified simply by silhouette, and many of these characters were recorded in history. His treatment of subject matter, whether they were portraits or a scene of a Parisian nightlife or intimate study, were described as alternately sympathetic and dispassionate, but described as a true reflection of society. His paintings of dance hall performers and prostitutes are personal and humanistic, revealing the sadness and humor hidden behind the rice powder and the gaslights. Although he died tragically very young at the age of 36, his influence was long-lasting, and it's fair to say that without Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, there would be no Andy Warhol. In Expressionism art, and art in particular, color became highly intense and non-naturalistic. The brushwork was typically free, generous, and highly textured. Expressionist art tended to be emotional and also mystical, and it was seen as the extension, but the reality of Romanticism. Let's take a look at Mark Chagall. He was a Russian-French-Jewish artist. He drew on the currents of Cubism, Fauvism, Symbolism, and he created his own brand of Expressionism in which he depicts these dreamy scenes of his Belarusian hometown. And while in Paris, the highest point of the modern avant-garde movement at this time, Chagall develops his own visual language, which included these eccentric motifs, ghostly figures floating in the sky, the gigantic fiddler dancing on miniature dollhouses, transparent wombs, within them tiny offspring sleeping maybe upside down. Now, in 1914, his work was exhibited in Berlin, and it had an impact on German expressionists, which extended well beyond into World War I. He never associated his work with any specific movement. He considered his repertoire to be, in his word, a vocabulary of images meaningful to only me, but they did inspire many, including the Surrealists. Pablo Picasso remarked in the 1950s When Henri Matisse dies, Chagall will be the only painter left who understands what color really is. If we're ranking the most powerful of emotions, it's really hard to top love. How can something as complex as love make its way into a canvas? In the words of the Russian-born artist Mark Chagall, he said, "In our life, there is a single color, as on an artist's palette, which provides the meaningful depiction of life and art, and it's the color of love." After fleeing the jailing of Jewish artists in St. Petersburg and studying art in Paris in the 20th century, he returns to his hometown in Russia to develop his impressionistic style. And he took what he learned from the Surrealists and the Fauvists in Paris, and he built on their traditions of channeling the unconscious and abandoned the realist form to render pure emotions through his artwork. A large amount of Chagall's inspiration came from his wife, Bella Rosenfeld, and after his death from other relationships he had in his life. And while his works maintain some connection of form to this idea of love, fully embracing abstraction, his use of bright, vibrant colors and varying techniques makes his emotions very apparent. He said, "Only love interests me, and I am only in contact with things that revolve around love." Let's take a look at another important expressionist artist, Egon Schiele. He was an Austrian, skipped that slide. Mark Chagall when he was a little older. The Austrian artist, Egon Schiele, was inspired by Expressionism as well, and he interpreted that style as individual and personalized. Schiele sought to express the decadence of modern Austria through similarly expressive representations of the human body by these kind of detailed, sensual lines, garish colors, distorted figures, and he embedded the subjects with these highly sexual and psychological themes. The original Expressionist movement ideas about spirituality and primitivism and the value of the abstract art world would also hugely influence an array of unrelated movements that eventually moved a little closer to abstract expressionism. The expressionist metaphysical outlook and instinctive discomfort with the modern world impelled them into antagonistic attitudes that would continue to be characteristic of the various avant-garde movements throughout the centuries. Many avant-garde artists shared an inclination towards abstraction, symbolic content, and spiritual illusion, and they sought to express the emotional aspects of being thorough and highly symbolic and brightly colored renderings. Egon Schiele is one of the central figures of the Austrian Expressionism, and he's known for his jarring and oftentimes grotesque renderings of overt sexualities, bodies contorted in unnatural positions, for example. This woman's bold and intense expression assertively confronts the viewer and directly contradicts the artistic standards of passive feminine beauty. Although blatantly controversial throughout his lifetime, Schiele was recognized for his skilled draftsmanship, his use of sinewy lines to evoke the decadence and immorality of modern Austria. How about Vasily? This is Egon Schiele's work as well. How about Vasily Kandinsky? He believed that total abstraction offered the possibility for, in his words, profound transcendental expression that copying from nature only interfered with this process. He was highly inspired to create art that communicated this universal sense of spirituality, and he innovated a pictorial language that only loosely related to the outside world. but expressed volumes about his inner spiritual experience. His visual vocabulary developed through 3 phases, shifting from his early representative canvases and their divine symbolism into what became rapturous and operatic spiritual dimensions. And he transitioned completely into non-objective paintings and watercolors, which emphasized color balance, form, and figurative representation in an abstract world. He believed that each time period puts its own indelible stamp on artistic expression, and his vivid interpretations of color through musical and spiritual sensibilities altered the artistic landscape at the start of the 20th century, going forward into the perception of what eventually became the modern age and modern art. Painting, he said, was deeply spiritual for me, and he sought to convey a profound spirituality and depth of human emotion through a universal language of abstract form and colors that transcended cultural and physical boundaries. He viewed the non-objective abstract art as the ideal visual mode to express what he called the inner necessity of the artist and to convey universal human emotions and ideas. He viewed himself as a prophet whose mission was to share his ideal with the world for the betterment of society. And he viewed music as the transcendent form of non-objective art. He felt that musicians could evoke images in a listener's mind merely with their sounds. He strove to produce similarly object-free, spiritually rich paintings that alluded to sound rather than reality and created these emotions through a sense of sensation, the unity of sensation. And his breakthrough canvas depicted these ideas and this deceptively simple image that came from the original idea being this lone rider moving away from realism into abstractionism. He applied this throughout his landscape of canvases. And this particular painting was a decisive moment in Kandinsky's idea of developing pictorial language. So here in the start of his expression of emotion, the sun-dappled hillside reveals a keen interest in contrasts, light and dark, as well as movement and stillness, which were major themes throughout most of his compositions. This was the link and the bridge between post-impressionism and the growing expressionist movement, and this canvas became the emblem of the expressive possibilities that were eventually embraced by the avant-garde. Paul Klee and his notion became the central principle for transcending realistic depiction into abstraction. And his highly individualized style was influenced by the movements in art that included Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and all the modern art movements from that point on. He was a natural draftsman, and he experimented with and eventually deeply explored color theory, writing about it extensively. His lectures on writings on form and design theory, for example, were published in English. They're known as the Paul Klee Notebooks, and they are important for modern art, just like Leonardo da Vinci's codices on painting for the Renaissance and his codices on engineering are important for the development of science. His work reflects his dry humor. He was very childlike in his perspective, and they also represent some of his beliefs and views and his musicality. Now, Franz Mark was a painter, printmaker, watercolorist. He was a key member of the Expressionist movement as well, and he was known for his use of animal symbolism, which was a very important element in this movement, the Expressionist movement. The lush colors, the fracturing of space, the geometric forms show the influence that eventually led to Cubism. However, he was influenced by his contemporaries. He did emphasize these fantastic subjects that were derived from the material world, but were moved into this transcendental image of modern art. For the artist, the movement away from realistic depiction represented a turn towards spiritual and emotional, and therefore authentic. As with many expressionists, color became the descriptive element for Franz Mark, and he drew on the emotive qualities of his palette to convey his vision. Vasily Kandinsky says, art speaks where words are unable to explain. Expressionism was also found all over the American pop art movement, which was the next step after modern art, but is considered to be an expressive art movement, considered to be the modern version of Expressionism. And this came out in the 1960s with so many emotions present in that era. Politics, creative luminaries turned to their art to express themselves. It's safe to say that very few artists had more of an impact on the 60s Expressionist movement than Peter Max. Max's family traveled extensively throughout his formative years, and they lived in Germany, China, Israel, and then he eventually settled in Brooklyn, where he started his adult life. And he quickly developed this obsession with Expressionism, and this followed him everywhere. From a young age, he was fascinated with how color and sound interacted. He created canvases meant to convey auditory subjects through color. It was when Max moved to Brooklyn in the 1950s that he was first able to channel his love of American pop culture into his art, pioneering the neo-expressionist movement. In 1961, he opened a graphic design studio with his friends, and he began receiving national praise for his psychedelic expressionist works full of abstraction and raw emotion. Like most pop artists and graphic designers, his work wasn't confined to galleries or museums. Many of his prints were found on movie posters and billboards, hanging on the walls of college dorm rooms. His artwork became so popular during this period that he helped to set the emotional tone and the response of the 1960s into this motion on canvas. I'd like to highlight him a little more. I'm working on a new presentation, and Peter Max is the newest artist. So when I'm done with that, we're definitely going to do this at Hudson. So stay tuned for more information on the newest addition to my series. So in summary, Expressionist artists sought to express the meaning of emotional experience rather than physical reality. And it gave passage for other realms of expression. Now, Expressionism is notoriously difficult to define, in part because of the overlapping other major isms that eventually became Futurism, Cubism, and Surrealism. But one of the central means by which Expressionism identified itself in the avant-garde movement was the way that it marked a distance away from tradition and the cultural institution of art as a whole, and the relationship of that to realism. And it moved the furthest away from the dominant conventions of representation. More explicitly, the Expressionists rejected the ideology of realism. Expressionism is the art of emotional over physical. Without emotion, art as we know it wouldn't exist. And artists are driven to create a way to grapple with their feelings, and viewers are drawn to their works because these emotions are universal and recognized. It took Impressionists into this new relationship of asking the audience, in the words of Peter Frampton, do you feel like I do? 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes, I do. That's conveyed on the canvas. And that's the story of Expressionism. I think we're going to share some questions at the end.
Yeah, it looks like we have a couple questions.
Okay, great.
One of our patrons asked if Salvador Dali was considered an expressionist artist.
Well, he was on the edge of the Expressionist movement, but he's one of the first artists that moved into surrealism. So he's really considered to be a surrealist artist, but began as an expressionist at the end of that movement, yes.
Okay. One comment from Rachel: Chagall floating figures represented the beliefs of a branch of Jewish mysticism.
Yes, absolutely. He was very entranced in his religion and interpretation of emotions through that. Absolutely.
Okay, Ed asked, once initiated and recognized, do movements ever end or do they evolve with their definitions? What is the current movement?
Oh, wow. That's a difficult one. I don't know that there has been a current movement since the late 70s, early 80s, but it's an evolution and it's a pattern and it's a process. I don't think they begin and end. I think they overlap. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to put together a visual showing how these movements all kind of transition into each other. But I don't have an answer to that question, what the current movement is. Mm-hmm. I think realism was in the late 1980s into the 90s, kind of a romantic realism, and then a departure again after that. So I'll have to look into that and see what people say. I'm sure it's a variety of answers.
Dottie asked an interesting question from your presentation. Were there any women expressionists? I think you covered all men.
Well, I think that the issue was the sensuality of the modern art. Mary Cassatt was the first one who actually embraced that idea of Impressionism, but was still prohibited from painting nudes because of the definition of her time. But there were not very many, I can't even really name, but a couple women who were considered to be expressionist artists, mainly because of the provocative nature of it.
Okay. Oh, and Ed asked, is there a genealogical chart of the evolution of the movements?
I'm trying to come up with kind of a visual that will put the years together and the overlapping. I'm working on a presentation that talks about this movement of art, but stay tuned. It'll come out eventually.
Rachel suggested maybe the artist Bertha Morisset as an expressionist.
She's still in the Impressionist era, defined as an Impressionist. That's a good question. I don't know that I've ever seen her moving into the Expressionist realm.
And Marcia asked a personal question for you, Felicia. Do you personally like Expressionism or Impressionism better?
Oh, that's such a tough question. I love the emotive idea of Expressionism. I don't lean towards abstractionism, and I don't lean towards things that are primitive, just from a personal standpoint. I like the story of the Impressionists. So it's hard to say, it's hard to separate their lives and what they accomplished with their style. So I still embrace that style because of all that they did to change our world and how we see art.
Okay, let's see. Susan asked, there are people who pour paint on canvas and then tilt it around. Would you consider that art when it isn't, I'm sorry, would you consider that art when it doesn't convey emotion or reality or much influence on the art of the artist?
That's a tough question. What is art? I mean, you know, that question. It's art if you view it that way. I don't necessarily think that abstract art is very emotive. And when we moved from abstract into this kind of a primitive abstract movement, which was around the 1990s, I think we kind of got away from emotion. So I don't know, taking on a life of its own, I'm maybe there's some way of interpreting that. I don't think I have the intellectual level to analyze that art or not art.
All right, we have one question left for the night, and then we'll wrap up. Jules asked, Renoir and other painters and others painted many nudes. Were these not considered as shocking as expressionists like Klimt?
Oh, they were very shocking, absolutely shocking. The fact that these artists represented sexuality was all part of this Impressionist movement. And the modern art movement that eventually moved, you know, from Expressionist to post-Expressionist to post-Impressionist to Expressionist. Very shocking. Manet's painting, The Luncheon, was displayed behind a door, and people wanted it down because there were women there without clothes on, and these women were naked, not nude. Naked meaning there's a little pile of clothes that they just took off or they should have put back on. But yes, their work was very dramatically evocative, very much so.
Well, thank you so much, Felicia. I know Felicia always has her goal of teaching us 5 new facts during each lecture, and I think she did more than that. You packed a lot of information in a short time, so thank you so much, Felicia, for joining us again. And we hope that we hope to see some of your new lectures coming up at the library. Good. Always a pleasure to have you.
Good. Thank you so much. I'd love to have some input as to if you like these groupings, like we did the 1920s and we did Expressionism. I've got some other groups together, or if you like the individual artists, because I'm going to kind of branch out a little bit, and I'm curious what, without having you here and me seeing you smile or react, I don't know what the reaction is. So, you know, send me a line and just let me know what you think. I appreciate and value what.
Well, thank you everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you again, Felicia. Take care, everyone. Good night.
Bye.